that we're being broadcasted. While we wait for that, welcome. Thank you, everybody, for being here. This is our second and last panel for the evening, and it's going to be great because we have wonderful speakers. So we are going to be talking about India and about agricultural reform in India. And to do that, we have two really incredible speakers, and I'm very excited to learn from them myself. So let me begin by introducing them. So Professor Nitya Rao is a professor of gender and development at the University of East Anglia. She's worked extensively as a researcher and advocate in the field of women's rights, employment, and education over 3 decades. Her research interests include exploring the gender changes in land and agrarian relations, migration, and livelihoods, especially in the context of climate variability and economic precarity. So she's published extensively on these themes in journals, books, and she's engaged with policy and practice, both at the global level and otherwise. And apart from supporting networks of women's farmers in India, she served at the Global Advisory Committee of the United Nations Girls Education Initiative for over a decade. That's quite amazing. She's currently a member of the steering group of the high-level panel of experts to the Committee on the World Food Security. Okay, thank you, Nitya. And then here on my left is Bhaskar, and Professor Bhaskar Bira is the professor of political economy at the Department of Geography in Cambridge, and he's head of this department and was the founding director of Cambridge's Conservation Research Institute. He's a member of the University of Cambridge's Global Food Security Interdisciplinary Research Center, and his research examines the ways in which societies engage with land and nature, the political and economic context within communities, within which communities, businesses, and policymakers make choices and negotiate trade-offs over alternate resources, access, and new strategies. So he's contributed extensively to global science policy processes and dialogues, and chaired the Global Forest Expert Panel on Forests and Food. And he's currently leading a program on agrarian change and rural transformations in India, which is called Transforming India's Green Revolution by Research and Empowerment for Sustainable Food Supplies. So thank you both and welcome. And what we're going to do here is talk about the changes that Indian agriculture is facing, but also looking ahead and asking the question, what is Indian agriculture going to look like in a decade? Now, the last 12 months have been really tumultuous. There's been a lot of civil unrest combined with swarms of locusts, deteriorating air pollution, shrinking incomes, and revealing really worrying vulnerabilities in the system. It's also been, exceptionally, the last year has been one of the best for Indian agricultures in terms of the highest levels of outputs, highest food output, highest exports, better incomes to farmers because of the PM Kisan and higher procurement. And comparatively, agriculture has suffered less last year than a lot of the other sectors. So what I'd like to do is explore that paradox a little bit, and also talk about the fundamental shifts that are required to reshape farms and farming in India and improve the current system and promote a more positive and sustainable model at the same time. So drawing on the experience that our panelists have in policy making and in research, let's get into these questions around how we can improve the sustainability of farming practices and meet the nutritional needs of the country's booming population. So I'll begin maybe with Nitya. So one way to think about sustainability in agriculture would be to look at this aspect of economy and livelihoods, and the environmental question, and then the equity question. So say livelihoods, environmental, and equity. And let's get into each of those three. Now, beginning with the question of livelihoods, we know that Indian agriculture is suffering from long-term structural problems and is undergoing various crises at the same time. low farm wages, low food prices or rising food prices, low returns on production, competition in a post-harvest market system, and more. So do you think that agriculture remains viable as a means of livelihood in a country like India?
I think, thanks. And it's a really interesting question, but I would actually like to turn the question around and saying that rather than asking, is agriculture viable, but really think about why is it not viable and what's wrong with it. Despite the fact that in India, of course, more than 50% of the population still continue to depend on agriculture. And we've seen during the pandemic that many more people who lost their jobs, people who lost industrial service sector jobs, they basically came back to farming. And I was in the hills in Uttarakhand in April, just before the second phase of the lockdown. And the women actually said that for the first time, that agriculture had grown a lot because a lot of the empty plots, vacant plots, the migrant men had all returned. And they had also started cultivating. So actually, when you said that this year the production has gone up, there's been a record harvest, I think part of it is also to do with the extensive reuse of vacant lands and a more intensive use of land because of a larger number of people working on land. So I think to ask the question that why is it not viable, actually agriculture, if you look at it, right up to the 1980s, was growing at almost 10% per year. And then after that, till the 1990s, about 4, 5, 6%, which was also keeping in pace with the growth rate. And it's in the last 5 or 6 years. I mean, there has been crises, of course. I'm not underplaying that, but in the last 5, 6 years, it's kind of nosedived in terms of growth rate. So I think for me, the question is that what needs to be done to make it viable, and probably we'll discuss it further when we talk about sustainable agriculture. We've heard about regen agriculture in the previous session and so on. So I think I just want to say one thing about livelihoods, and that is, what are the main lessons from the 1960s or 70s, from the Green Revolution? Bhaskar mentioned that, I've been involved also in this project, Tigress, Transforming India's Green Revolution. So there were a lot of problems, environmental problems and so on, that came up. But to me, I think one of the key lessons was really the institutional and governance one, in terms of the coming together of farmers, of scientists, and public policy or policy makers. So I think much of this has been referred to as Charles mentioned about the different stakeholders, but I think the partnership or the coming together of these stakeholders towards one goal. So whether it was the incentives in terms of prices, purchase prices, market prices, the public distribution system, whether it was the credit and the inputs availability to the farmers, or scientists again were sort of provided sort of facilities, whether it was for the first time space research facilities or other kinds of good technology or nuclear research or space research, in order to actually be able to do that cutting edge research that was needed for that transformation at that particular moment in time. And of course, India was in a very different place because it didn't have enough food. It was dependent on PL 480 and so on. So I think for me, that's one lesson. And if you really wanted to change this in terms of making it viable, I think we can't really fix from one end until and unless we fix. We've heard some things about food systems today earlier, that until we try and fix at all these ends, in terms of seeing that there's remunerative prices. I think in the last session, Agnes Kalibata, many others spoke about markets, that how do we make sure that the markets are offering remunerative prices and farmers are not throwing away produce when there is glut or whatever it is. At the same time, there needs to be incentives. We talk about regenerative agriculture, but in the case of India, actually, the incentives to the agricultural universities, to the research institutes, really have not been turned in that direction of looking at, okay, if you're not going to use chemical fertilizers, how much of organic matter or how much of biofertilizer or manure, what kind of livestock is needed? I think these calculations and the sort of solid scientific base into what can make that happen, I think has not yet happened. And of course, there's a lot of contradictory policy. So whenever there's surplus production, then you immediately ban, you sort of export, or you at very low prices. I think we've seen this over the last couple of years. And I think it's sort of knee-jerk reactions. And so I think that, if these, that's to me the one lesson, not the actual technologies, but if we can think about this partnership and this coordination between farmers, scientists, markets, policymakers, I think it is possible to make agriculture viable. Maybe I'll stop with that for the moment.
Yeah, and Oscar, if I can ask you that same question, I mean, does the next generation of young people in India even aspire to work on the farm? And does agriculture remain a viable means of livelihood?
Thanks, Radhika. I'll just pick up on that in a second, but I'll just come back with a bit more context if that's useful.
Yeah.
So, I mean, people have mentioned already that about half the population currently still does depend on agriculture. So it suggests that they're making do somehow. And I want to come back to that in a second. But, it contributes a bit under 20% of India's GDP at the moment. We've got, thinking about young people, which you asked me about, there's about estimated to be 600 million young people, half of whom are under 25. So asking questions about what they aspire to do next with their lives is a really interesting question. And I think it's a universal. I was talking to Charles about this earlier. Most children of farmers don't aspire to be farmers worldwide. It's not an Indian issue. 30% of our 315 million migrants in India are youth. So this question about what they do next with their lives is really important. And the agricultural context is one which is dominated by small farmers, smallholders, predominantly owning, less than 4 hectares is the kind of typical holding size. So in that context, the gains of the Green Revolution have been concentrated in some regions only, and for a small class of farmers. But the majority of the farming population hasn't necessarily benefited from those high-intensive, high-capital inputs. So in that context, the question of can you make a viable living from the farm really becomes one of what else do you do beyond farming? Increasingly, a farm household has a portfolio, they cannot rely just on farming. From the farm, you can probably sustain yourself for 6 or 7 months of the year. And the rest of your family, remittances, migration, non-farm employment become really important. So the agrarian transition that was meant to take place was meant to be a transition that was not just about improving productivity on the farm, but also about creating rural jobs, non-farm employment that would allow people to diversify from the farm. Because what you're getting is obviously, as generational inheritance takes place, you're getting fragmentation of holdings as well. So a farm that might have been viable 3 generations ago has now been shared over time and is no longer viable as a single unit. So how does that household 3 generations later actually survive for 12 months of the year? And that's through looking at non-farm options. So I mean, I'll just throw in some data that I brought along just to kind of contextualize. So, and this is based on the National Sample Survey of 2013. Of 63.5% households that reported cultivation to be their principal source of income, only 12% were not engaged in something else as well. So farming is your primary activity, but the majority, over 88%, are doing something else to supplement their income. And that's how you sustain yourself. And then the question is, for young people, these 300 million who are under 25, they see their parents struggling to maintain their livelihoods on the farm. Education has been really successful. Their aspirations are no longer to maintain those farm-based livelihoods. They want to work elsewhere. So it's about creating non-farm jobs in the rural areas and about ensuring that in the small towns, particularly, not everyone's going to migrate to the mega cities. And Nithya mentioned the impact of the pandemic. We all saw those terrible images of people migrating, walking home, because the cities were no longer hospitable once the lockdowns happened. So it's not just thinking about the viability of farm-based incomes, but about what's happening in the rural non-farm sector and what's happening to create viable jobs in particularly small towns, I would say. Everyone's not going to move to the mega city. So it's a bit complex. but it does mean that we shouldn't just focus on farm-based livelihoods or farm-based productivity.
Can I just add a small comment to that? I think this year, you mentioned the high-level panel of experts to the CFS, and this year's report, which was just launched in July, was on youth engagement in food systems and food systems transformations. And I think if you look at it across the globe, like Bhaskar said, and of course in Europe as well, it's really about pluri-activity or multiple livelihood activities at the same time. So farming remains part of the portfolio. And I think what was very interesting when we produce a report, and there's more data in the report in terms of employment, that actually they do aspire to leave the rural sector. And this is for multiple reasons. I think one is the economic or the livelihood, that it's not remunerative enough, or the terms of trade vis-a-vis industry or services, the earnings are much lower within the agricultural sector. That was linked to your first question on viability. But also it's somehow constructed as if you're rural, then you're kind of backward, you're traditional, you have low status, you are not modern, and so on. So people are also, we found in our research, that the young people, basically, they don't mind staying in agriculture. In fact, many of them have come back during the pandemic, but they want to somehow construct a more kind of respectable kind of identity, something more modern. So if you look at the Green Revolution Punjab itself, there were tractors, there were all these young men coming back from wherever they were, driving the tractors or driving the harvesters and so on. And I've been doing some work with coastal marine fisheries. And we find that actually these young men, they're very well educated up to graduate level. They try to migrate to the non-farm sector. The jobs are not there for their level of education. So they get into this sort of gig economy, delivering food or something like that. And that's not satisfying either. So they're really looking for also some kind of, intellectual, and I have been focusing a lot on knowledges, because they also want some kind of stimulation, intellectual satisfaction from money is one part, like all of us. Why do we think of rural people differently? I think we need our salaries, but we also want to do something which is creative, which is intellectually satisfactory. And this is very much the case when you speak to young people. So in this fisheries, actually, many of these young men, they've spent a couple of years in Singapore or in the Gulf or wherever, on jobs. Migrant jobs are not easy. They require 12, 14 hours of work, with men sharing small spaces, not getting proper food, etc. Often abused and subject to violence. And they then feel that their life at home is really nice. And now they've come back with sort of, the mobile. I mean, the previous session we were hearing about digital tools. Now they've got sort of post-tsunami. There's been a lot of investments in terms of, weather information, satellite information, where do you go, what are the wave heights, and so on. With, again, a lot of coordination with the US, actually, Weather Services, the Indian Earth Sciences Department, and companies who are producing this mobile technology. And now actually these boys or young men, they really feel very satisfied, because when they go on their boats, they have the GPS, and then they have a, something fish finder, then they have something. So they can show that they're not doing traditional fisheries, but they're doing, it's still small scale. It's not capitalist or industrial fisheries. It's still very much small scale fisheries on small boats, but they've got all this other stuff, which also, of course, contributes to reducing risk in terms of, and enhancing resilience and so on. So I just wanted to say that, for youth, when we say that youth are not interested in farming, youth are not, actually, in many contexts, they don't really have a choice, because they don't have other sort of satisfying jobs. And therefore, how do we make agriculture or the rural sector, much more both enhancing incomes and returns through market linkages, through digital tools, but also much more kind of, intellectual or satisfactory in terms of the work element.
And make it more attractive for all of them. Yeah. I mean, apart from livelihoods, there's also, apart from this non-viability of livelihoods, there's also this question of the environmental changes and the vulnerabilities that we're seeing increasingly, whether they're floods or droughts, changing temperatures, pests, extreme weather events. All of these are rising in frequency and in intensity. And that sort of environmental crisis is further amplified by the rise of industrial farming. what would be really interesting is to be able, if maybe Bhaskar, I can ask you this, if you could lay out the key environmental debates that are, plaguing Indian agriculture.
I mean, I have to say, Charles already did this brilliantly.
Yeah.
So I don't want to sort of rehearse what he's already said so lucidly. But what we have seen is challenges around groundwater availability. Water tables have declined dramatically. Salinity, both in coastal areas as well as in some of the green revolution areas, partly because of overuse of chemical fertilizer or the wrong application of chemical fertilizer. We know that climate change is bringing changes in temperature and precipitation regimes, so people's farming practices have to adapt to the impacts of climate change. We're seeing increasing evidence of drought in drought-prone areas. So, it's a litany which is very familiar, unfortunately. I would, in fact, turn that around a little bit again and say, perhaps the biggest environmental problem is the choice of crops. Because the way in which agriculture, not just in India, again, has evolved is that we have harnessed nature in ways that are not natural. And I'm going to start with California because, Lake Mead has dried up. The Hoover Dam is no longer going to be able to sustain agriculture in the west of America. That's the reality. Some of you may have seen the images that were, broadcast about a month ago. People were growing almonds in California in a desert. And that's an inappropriate crop choice. So we have the same problem in India. We have sugarcane in some of the driest parts of the country. It should not grow there, but it's an outcome of history. It's an outcome of political choices. And it is where the political power base of some of the most important political leaders in the country come from. So shifting away from sugarcane in Maharashtra might be ecologically the right thing to do. It's politically impossible. But that's the environmental question. Yeah. Climate change will happen. Environmental change will happen. And we can't control it, but we're making choices. We're actively making choices that are exposing the agricultural sector to those vulnerabilities. And that's a difficult conversation. How do we move people who are dependent on the rice wheat economy in some parts of the country or the sugarcane economy in other parts of the country through the minimum support price structure, through the political support that they get? How do you move away from that particular safe crop, which is ecologically unviable at the moment? So that I would call that the environmental problem.
And so if one was to think about what sustainable agriculture really means in an Indian context, how would you?
And I'm going to
Yeah,
defer a little bit more to because Nitya has been working with some interesting experiments in the south in these dry range areas. It's about having that conversation, which is ecologically, if sugarcane is non-viable in the rain-fed areas, what are those areas likely to be able to sustain long-term, which will regenerate the soil, which will respond to the changing temperature and precipitation regimes that we're experiencing, and produce an output that gives farmers enough of a return on farming. So I'm drawing Nitya in because there's been some really interesting work around what people are calling zero budget natural farming. And I know you've had some engagement with that. So I think this is a good opening for you.
Yeah, thanks very much. In fact, this, of course, that became a bit controversial because it was called initially zero budget natural farming. And there's nothing called zero budget because everything needs inputs or some kind of cost. I think in the previous session which I attended, we heard about that it may not be in terms of higher yields, but you may get save on inputs. So, but there is a cost. There is a investment component to it. It's now being called as the community-based natural farming because of the critique of the zero budget. And it's a very interesting experiment because it's got political buy-in. So it's in Andhra Pradesh state in southern India. And I think what they have tried to do is really start with learning from farm families. Of Agnes Kalibata said about, this was our knowledge when growing up that, we did crop rotation or we had multiple crops or integrated farming systems. So I think there is all this knowledge. And I think one thing that has happened is the gap between sort of scientists and farmers, where farmers' science is not really considered as science. So I think one thing is quite radical, and that is to really look at that also as science. I mean, that both are different kinds of science, that farmers have knowledge, and that needs to be, we need to look at it and we need to harness it. And I think here very interesting is the gender question also, that with this whole thing that we spoke about, livelihoods and the crisis in farming and so on, that a lot of men migrating out, because that's the nature of sort of society, where men can much more easily move compared to women who may have children, who may have care responsibilities, etc. That we're not actually asking women at all what they know or what they do and why they do it. And actually there's lots of innovative practice in terms of, mixed cropping, because when women are in charge, they're also, because they have the roles across the food system, if you like, in terms of providing food to the household or subsistence or consumption, as well as the production and income earning side, then they're thinking that, okay, we need something, we need to grow a couple of vegetables or some lentils or something to consume at home. So they're, even if not on the main plot, they're doing these practices. So what this experiment has done is really, it has made its entry point women's self-help groups. They've entered through women's self-help groups, which in Andhra have been built by the state for the last 20 years. And they're now channeling them into, and they brought agricultural graduates. Now that's a very interesting part of the experiment. So the government has recruited agricultural graduates for 3 years, and they're paying their salaries and basing them in these villages and saying, okay, now talk to these women's groups and then come up with something from your knowledge and from these women's knowledge and do something, and actually respond to what the women are doing. How do they improve their practices? How can they improve, carbon or soil cover, organic matter, and also in different ecosystems. So different agroecological. So it's not going to be the same in a tribal area versus a drought-prone area versus a coastal area. So you need different strategies. And what they're finding very interestingly is that a lot of learning and unlearning, because many of the agricultural graduates, for instance, they're taught one curriculum. So suddenly you're posted in a saline coastal, soil. They don't exactly know what to do there, or in a forest. You don't, so they're kind of used to taught in their curriculum about plain areas, basically, and how do you manage there. So I think that's been a very interesting experiment, also linking with many of the things that have come up today, earlier in the afternoon, about market linkages, about a combination of subsistence plus market, paying attention to nutrition, because India has a big problem of course, undernutrition, of paying attention to that. Another very interesting, and this is not within Andhra, but I think in Tamil Nadu, some of the experiments have been what Bhaskar was talking about earlier, in terms of also building the skills of youth in farming. So giving them skilled jobs. So things we were talking about, regenerative agriculture. Okay, what does it need? It needs organic fertilizer, or it needs biopesticides, or it needs, like neem powder, or, moringa powder, or other kinds of things. And actually based on research, they're also now training the local youth to sort of look at plant, soil health. And we've got a little experiment as part of our research also in terms of soil health cards, working with communities, that how do you identify what are the issues. And so young people who are graduates, let's say, you give them a little bit more and give them a little bit more training actually into the technical knowledge on soil health. And they then go around helping people to identify and, okay, this is what you need to do. So there are groups doing sort of vermicompost or other kinds of biofertilizers or neem powder for pests control, which is also generating incomes for the youth. And plus it's giving them status, because in the community now they're seen as somebody, an expert to whom I can go to. If I need something on my soil, I go to this person and I ask that person, please guide me on what to do with my soil. So I think there are interesting experiments like this, which are addressing the problem of environment and sustainable agriculture, or regenerative agriculture, dealing with water stress. This we heard in the earlier session about basically covering the soil or with organic matter is very important in very drought conditions in order to retain the humidity or the soil moisture. So I think, how can you use whatever resources and knowledges we have in order to build, address the environmental question. Environmental question with small farmers can never be addressed without looking at livelihoods at the same time. So somebody who's hungry, if we say that, conserve your environment and have 50% less yield, it's not going to make sense. So I think the two have to be addressed in a kind of Indian rural context together.
I
One point which comes from what Nitya has been saying, which is about diversity of systems as well. So it's a vast country with agroecological difference and socio-economic difference. And what's difficult then is to impose a single package that will work everywhere. So the principles that emerge from the kinds of things Nitya is talking about are about being adaptable to local context, respecting both local knowledge and scientific knowledge, but getting them to speak together, and then creating systems that are appropriate in place. But that takes time, effort, and it's quite difficult in a model where what you're really looking for is the package that will fix it. Because sadly, there isn't a package that will fix it with that diversity. So these experiments are demonstrating the value of that alternative, but that's a complex alternative. Sorry, I just needed to make that point.
Kind of uptake, right? Even once the experiment is over. I will come back to you about this idea of feminization of agriculture, but just going back to the environmental question, right? Because I think while of course, the environmental question is about types of cropping, I don't think we can ignore climate change. And especially given the nature of Indian agriculture and that it's made up of all of these small land holdings, what kind of adaptation mechanisms do we see in Indian agriculture right now? And are small-scale farmers able to adapt at all, given the environmental changes that are ongoing and increasing?
I mean, I think the farming community is an adaptive community. That's what they've done all throughout. And environmental change, climate change, what we are seeing in terms of climate change is the most recent of changes to impact upon them. So they're responsive to the conditions in which they have to conduct their agricultural practice. So in some sense, they're a very adaptive community. It's the way they survive. Survival comes from being adaptive. But then the scale of change that is which is impacting them is significantly greater. So I mean, I'll go back to some of the coastal Tamil Nadu cases that our teams have been working on in. And I mean, what's happened there is that, for example, rice, which was triple cropped, is now essentially being cropped once. You have increasing salinity of that soil. And they're now, and this is on the coast. So, you had the impacts of the tsunami, you had kind of the impacts that then led to those coastal areas becoming uncultivable effectively. So the lands become fallow, weeds take over, which makes it very difficult to kind of actually regenerate. And then if those lands are no longer being used for agriculture, we're starting to see things like the shrimp industry coming in to try and kind of take those lands over for coastal aquaculture, but on a different scale. So how do you respond to that? Just recently, I was looking at a very interesting experiment from coastal Vietnam, which kind of suggests that you could do rice and shrimp together in a freshwater system. So can you actually respond to it in that way by creating alternatives? But actually, that requires interventions that go beyond the farm level. So the farmer will adapt because that's what they have to do. But actually, it's about then harnessing some of that other knowledge, looking at these alternative systems to allow, again, a more appropriate climate adaptive system to be introduced. But at the individual farm level, they just have to adapt. That's what they do. It's about making sure that you've got the equivalent of bread on the table the next month. So you have to adapt.
I think the question is, are you adapting with the same level of productivity and sustainability? And that's the challenge.
No, and you clearly aren't. Right. Yeah, because the rains are delayed for reasons that you don't fully understand, or they're erratic and they come earlier the next year. So what you adapted for 1 year is undone by what happens the following year, because it's so much of this is about the kind of erratic nature of weather patterns. It's not changing in predictable ways. So it's not easy to adapt to that. What you do is you learn from experience, but last year's experience isn't necessarily a good predictor of next year.
Just add one small point to that. And I think this I agree with Bhaskar's conclusion, and I think it's also partly linked to sort of the breakdown of community systems and community institutions for adaptation. So I do a lot of work with indigenous communities in India, and earlier they used to have, community mechanisms for storage of seeds, for instance, or for storage of grains during this. Now these systems have all broken down. So what we see, for instance, that if a crop fails, for instance, because at the right time, rain didn't come, so it didn't germinate. Actually, there's no way that once that crop is dried out, that they can quickly get access to seed and plant. So earlier, their community institutions were much more resilient in that they would store and they would share. And I think the state is not able to, by the time the bureaucracy works in terms of declaring a drought or declaring a flood and then bringing in the code and then giving the seeds and so on, it's too late. That season has gone. So I think we've sort of destroyed one system, but have not really got the other system to work efficiently enough.
You talked earlier about sort of reducing farm incomes, the environmental changes, and this sort of movement of men from the rural to the urban. And now maybe in the last year they're coming back, but the overall trend is sort of rural to urban, and this feminization, right, of agriculture. And how do we envision reforms in Indian agriculture and social welfare such that women's labor in agriculture and nutrition is made more visible and it's properly supported?
I think that's the $1 million question, which we've all been struggling. I think I've been involved with the advocacy on this for at least the past 15, 20 years, that, women are farmers and they need to be recognized as farmers. I think even globally, actually, the construct of a farmer is somehow seen as male. And actually, if you look at count the numbers, it is, as we've been talking about, everybody acknowledges feminization. So in India, from the 1980s onwards, that feminization has been acknowledged in sort of documents that agriculture is feminized, women are farming, but still we have, so 1980s, I'm talking about the 6th five-year plan had a chapter on women and agriculture, where it said that, women are sort of farmers. This was with a lot of advocacy from the women's movement in India and so on. But now it's 2020 or 2021. So even with 40 years, everybody talks and accepts, but there's actually no rights. So women are not entitled to farmland. They don't inherit farmland. And unfortunately, because they don't inherit farmland, then they don't have access to sort of bank credit or to other, extension services, membership in cooperatives. Everything gets linked to farmland. So actually in the last 15 years, there's also been sort of a lot of advocacy to say, fine, if inheritance is a sort of emotional issue because it's sort of patrilineal and it's the man inheriting land from his ancestors, etc. So you don't want to share it with women, doesn't matter. But can we have, again, a community system, maybe at the local government level, that we accept the definition of farmers? The FAO definition of farmers is basically a very good and wide one, that anybody who engages in any kind of farming or agriculture or allied activity, including collection of forest produce or goat rearing or pig rearing or dairy or whatever, is considered a farmer. If we take this definition, then all women are farmers. And it doesn't matter if they don't inherit land, but if you can acknowledge that they are farmers, give them the recognition and give them the other entitlements at least as a first step. So if the man is not there and I need to, buy fodder for my livestock, but I don't have any cash and I can't go to the bank and get cash, I mean, what do I do? So I am below par or below productive, so that's why we say that there's a gap between women farmers and men farmers. Many studies like in Ethiopia and other countries have shown that, female managed farms and male managed farms is actually a yield gap. And the reason is not that women are not good as farmers, but actually they don't have the resources accessible to invest in these farms. And where experiments have been done where they have the same resources, actually they're more productive than sort of male managed farms. So I think this is, I mean, I guess it's just politics. I mean, at the end of the day, it's political advocacy. I think in India, we also had the national policy, the National Farmers Commission, and I think probably when we talk about the farmers' protest, I can say a little bit more about that, but which very strongly advocated in the national policy of farmers to take the FAO definition of farmers, to include women, to have a new deal for women farmers as well. And there was a draft, actually, law that came into Parliament called the Draft Women Farmers Entitlement Bill in 2011, but which never got passed, and then it lapsed at the end of the parliamentary period. So I think this has been going on now for 15 years at least, that, you know, you have to equalize entitlements, even if not land, in order to actually move towards a more productive, healthy, sustainable, all the adjectives that we've been using for farming. If you don't take women on board and give them some rights, you know, they're not, we're not really going to achieve much. And I already said, I think the point about nutrition, which you raised, is really interesting, because that goes to the heart, actually, of domestic unpaid work of women. So one is the farming work itself is kind of recognized in talk, but not in policy or in law. And the domestic work is completely unpaid and unrecognized. The cooking, the feeding, you know, what happens between sort of the farm and the table, or the farm and the fork, all that is done by women, but with actually very little support. And I think now there's some change that, you know, you realize that, okay, women have to collect water, they have to collect cooking fuel, and therefore try to make some of these things more accessible to reduce the drudgery or to reduce the burden of domestic work. But I did a study in Odisha and Maharashtra, where actually the time spent, which was actually linking agriculture and nutrition, and a big factor affecting child undernutrition in India is actually lack of women's time, especially during the agricultural seasons, because we did a time use study, very in-depth with a few households, but what we found that during planting and harvesting, women's time use on the farm increased to 8 to 10 hours a day, and therefore their time for cooking, which is takes the maximum time amongst all other domestic tasks, reduced. Many women in cotton planting areas in Vidarbha, Maharashtra, said that after a whole day of cotton picking, the smell was so much, because they don't have protective gear, that they had headaches and they just came home and went to sleep. So they couldn't really cook. So of course, if women don't cook, then this has implication for household nutrition, because then, you know, the husband puts together something, but it's usually just a pot of rice with, you know, something, and it's not really a full or we saw pictures in Charles on the burgers or whatever. So you maybe do an order in of something. It's not really a full meal. So I think that the whole gender and the women's labor recognition question is very important for farming, but also for nutrition.
And it's alarming how far behind we are.
Yeah.
I'm just picking up on that. When you talked a little bit about migration and male migration in particular, which has potentially been one of the drivers for what we're calling feminization. But as Nitya has illustrated, if the men have migrated away and the women are working on the farm, that doesn't reduce their other burdens. They continue to be the primary caregiver, the primary feeder, so they're doing everything that they used to do, and they all had full working lives. And now suddenly they've also started to become farmers because the men have migrated away and are no longer tilling the farm. So in addition to all their other burdens, they've adopted the burden of farming on top of that. And this is where sort of linking the recognition point that Nitya has articulated with the welfare and support. So if those children are going to be fed, can we actually introduce feeding policies? Can we start to talk about creches in the rural areas so that women, when they're in the farm, actually are able to have their children being looked after? So it's about the welfare package that surrounds women farmers, as well as the recognition in terms of rights and land titles and all the other things that constrain their ability to perform that function as a farmer. But if that other burden has not been taken away and you've added the responsibility of farming, where's the time to do it all? And so then it's about the welfare package that reforms also need to think about.
Why not?
But I've learned a lot about the challenges and the current situation. Some of it's been prompted by the pandemic. But where do you envisage the sector being in 10 years? How is it going to change in the next decade? And what's the one thing that we could do to enable it?
To the panelists.
Well, my response earlier suggested that there isn't one thing we can do because of the diversity of the country and the diversity of the social system. So there isn't a silver bullet, if that's what you're looking for. So
if we adopt that view, we will make incremental progress. Big step changes will only come when we hit another pandemic. I mean,
yeah,
I think
potentially.
always when we've got big problems, they're always very complex. There's lots of stakeholders. There's lots of things wrong. But somehow we need to identify one big priority and try and focus on it.
Implement the recommendations of the Farmers Commission.
That would be mine. And
Since you want a simple, answer.
But I think we can talk about the what that implementation also means in practice. Yeah. But yeah, continue.
I think for me, I mean, I'll definitely come to the Farmers Commission, and this was a component of that. But I think the one thing that can actually be a game changer, which we're seeing in the Andhra Pradesh case, is actually to recognize who is actually doing, who is the worker in the sector, and support them adequately. And from my perspective, definitely recognizing women farmers and supporting them. For instance, we have this cash transfer program called PM Kisan, that is a cash transfer for farmers, but it all goes to men. Whereas the women are the farmers. PM Kisan, 2,000 rupees is going to the farmer per quarter or whatever it is. It's all going to men. So I think that we have to sort of see it in a joined up. I mean, that production is men and reproduction is women. I think we have to get out of that mindset. If we get out of that mindset, women are willing to take the initiative, to go out, to do the work. They're doing it. And just a very recent from the farmers' protest is that, the Supreme Court in January this year, when the farmers were protesting in the Delhi border, the Supreme Court said that, the women were sitting there, it's very cold and so on. Why don't you go back to your homes? Your children need you and so on. And actually the women farmers were annoyed. And they said that, we're not sitting here as the mothers of our children, but we are sitting here as farmers. And why should we go back? When you're not asking the men farmers to go back, you're telling the women that you have reproductive responsibility, so you go back home. And that is coming from the highest court. I mean, this mindset, I think if we can shift it in relation to farming and agriculture, I think we can do a lot. I didn't say much about environment or the climate change adaptation, but we did research in 25 hotspots of climate change across Asia and Africa. And what we found there, that if you just support sort of women's agency, both individual and collective, you can actually, adapt. You can actually address some of the problems of adaptation. Women are doing it already, but it's just what we said earlier, that it's at a great health cost to themselves because they're overburdening themselves. They're sleeping less, they're eating less, and they're working harder. And that's not sustainable in terms of their personal health, because then they're going to collapse. But if we actually give them the support, both in terms of creches, childcare, clean drinking water, LPG cylinders, plus for productive inputs, and the extension and the training, I think because they're already doing that, but they're doing that with obstacles. So for me, that's the one thing. I think if you can look at, if you can sort of shift our mindset a little bit and recognize who is farming and support them, I think we can really make a difference.
I think you're the expert in the area, Nitya, and sort of, if you believe that, then we can start to think about how do we enable that. I mean, John, in the last session, I think asked a really important question at the end, and we didn't have time to discuss it, is who's accountable, whose responsibility is it? And, but yeah, I mean,
right now, a lot of responsibility is put on women, at least in the nutrition side of it, which she asked, that mothers are responsible for the nutrition of the children, women are responsible for feeding. But when you have responsibility, you need the rights and you need the enabling environment. You can't just have the responsibility and not have, the support. So
I was thinking, I think John was getting at, whose job is it to sort out this problem? Is it the academics? Is it industry? Is it government? Who is it?
I guess I mean, from my perspective, if I just take the same example and try and answer that question, I think government definitely, as I said, from the last 20, 30 years, women don't have land rights, they don't have credit rights, etc. I think also it is private industry and the private sector, because some of the areas where I have worked, that while, especially indigenous groups, where relatively they're more gender equal, if you like, at the household level. So men and women do share work. They're at the bottom of poverty, so maybe out of need, but they do, it's not that the man is kind of dominant. I mean, they're all poor and therefore they're supporting each other. But when you have either state actors or private sector actors coming, they actually seek out the man and they talk to the man and they won't talk to the woman to make the deal. So a lot of women said to me that I'm the one who's farming, but when the deal is made, it's the man. So when we were talking earlier about regenerative or resilient agriculture, so Koraput in Odisha, this is a very live situation where the paper industry is there and the uplands are being used now for eucalyptus plantations for the paper industry. And uplands used to be cultivated by the women in terms of vegetables, pulses, millets, all the nutritious and a diversified food, because the lowlands are more monocropped because of impact of green revolution, whatever. But the uplands really maintained these kind of resilient systems. Now they've been transferred to eucalyptus plantations on contract farming basis. When we spoke to the communities, the women very clearly said, okay, fine, like, it gets us some cash sometime, but apart from the environmental consequences in terms of water absorption and stress, but we were never consulted. The contractors came, spoke to our men, who are the landowners, technically, made the deal, and now we don't have land in which to farm all of this. So I think, the who is really an interconnected who. If we say that women are the key actors, let's say, for example, but I think we need the support of the state, of private sector, in order to actually enable that who might be on the field level, might be the woman, but without these other actors actually also changing the way they work, or the way they intervene.
Are there any lessons we can learn from, I don't know, Brazil or China, or is that these issues not being so prevalent there?
No, in fact, we can learn lessons from each of these. I don't know if you want to continue with this, or
Well, I maybe just why don't you finish answering that? And
I had an opportunity to visit, but I must say the politics is very important. So I was called for a government meeting in Brazil, actually 2009, when Lula was still a president, and they were leading on the zero hunger issue. And they gave a very central place in the ministry to sort of gender equality and so on. And they called this sort of meeting from across the globe of people from different, especially the BRICS sort of countries. So from India, me and a couple of others from Mozambique, from other places, to actually share this thing. But it was very interesting. I think there was a really very interesting lesson in terms of the whole food system, which Lula had in place in terms of land reform and giving sort of these land rights to communities, including to women, in terms of the credit linkage, in terms of the market and the value addition. And they brought up, and the nutrition. So they had something as part of zero hunger, that 50% of local production should actually be consumed locally. So through, whether it was schools, or whether it was, for the school noon meals, or for, childcare centers or local markets or whatever. But so there was an assured market for at least 50% of this local production. It was a very interesting model, and I think it had a lot of potential. But of course, with the government change, all that has been undone now. So I think I think the politics of it, we can't, we can't forget. I'm sure there are lessons, definitely, which we can learn from.
The most meaningful lesson from China would be the non-farm employment issue that I was talking about. The way in which China has secured its agricultural sector is by providing jobs outside of agriculture. So, I mean, if there's a lesson from China for the last 40 years, it's about what they've done outside of farming. And a lot can be learned from that.
We have about 5 minutes because then we'll have to give the floor to Chance for his comments. But I did have a question about farm laws, but I also want to give the audience and our audience online Maybe, did you have a question? So one question for you, and then I'll take one question online. I don't know if we'll have time for more. Please go ahead.
Thanks. My name is Amrita Dhawan. I'm a wealth economist. In economics, we have this whole theory of structural transformation that people are supposed to move from agriculture to industry, as you were just saying for China, right? So what you're suggesting with regenerative farming seems to be the opposite. You want people to stay on in agriculture. Of course, I realize there are no jobs at the moment in industry, but I mean, I wonder if it's possible to feed such a large population with this kind of regenerative farming, or, should it not? I mean, it should be much more on a much bigger scale, right? I mean, it has to commercialize, and there might be some contradiction with all the things you're suggesting over here. So I was just wondering.
So I think the one short sort of answer to that is that even that needs some kind of policy support. So for instance, price support here in the UK, for instance, for organic products, if you buy in the supermarket, you pay a slightly higher price, or there's a price premium. So I think this is something which doesn't not yet exist, this kind of price differential or some kind of policy support. But I think this also brings to the question of the farm laws and the protests, and also the report of the National Farmers Commission, which actually said for any kind of agriculture, three things at least are very critical. One is a remunerative price. So the farmer knows, and I think this came up in the previous session, that the farmer will produce or should be given that information or the price signals that if I produce this crop, that there will be a market for it, and this is the minimum price that I'm going to get for it. So there needs to be a minimum support price. The second thing is there needs to be assured market or assured procurement. So you can set a price, but then if you don't purchase at that price, then that's pretty much useless. And I think that's what's been happening in India, that they've been announcing a minimum support price for about 23 commodities now, not just the 7 grains, but fruits, vegetables, oilseeds, pulses, but they don't purchase at that price because there's no mechanism for purchase and storage and up the value chain. So I think that's the second component. And the third thing, of course, is sort of how do you then, if the state takes some responsibility that if the private sector is not going to purchase at these prices, then we are going to procure it, then there also needs to be a system in place for distribution. And I think that India has a very good system of public distribution, which really was the savior, I would say, in the case of the pandemic, that people at least had food grains to eat and they were not hungry. They may not have had a nutritious diet or a healthy diet, but they at least had something to fill their stomachs. So I think these at least are the three things. If we give these signals with regenerative, that there is a price, so go ahead and produce this. And if you can't sell in the market, then we'll procure it. Because how do you incentivize for people to shift from one system to another system? Those price incentives at the end of the day, I think have to be there. And if the state is going to procure, then you need a system also for distribution. I mean, without that, it's not going to happen. I think Odisha, again, is a very interesting state where I recently heard that, they're doing this as an experimental basis and the government is involved in it, that actually dried fish, they're drying fish and they're creating that fish powder, which can stay, and then they're distributing it through the childcare and the midday meal program. So it's a source of nutrition, but at the same time that, for these small fish vendors and women's groups and so on, who may not be able to sell fresh fish because of market collapse or whatever, they can dry it and then it's procured and then there's a clear distribution channel. So for me, I think, that's quite critical.
Bhaskar, just before you respond, because I think we are running out of time, but it would be incomplete if we didn't talk about the protest. So if you don't mind reflecting on that, even just for a couple of minutes after you finish answering the question, that would be great.
I mean, I'll actually try and link them.
Yeah.
Because I think at the heart of the issue that we're trying to kind of discuss here is to try and understand what is farming in India at the moment. Is it a business? Is it a way of life? Is it a survival strategy? Is it important because it generates public goods? So, and once you understand the answer to that question, you can start to understand the nature of public support. If it's a business, maybe there isn't a case for public support. Businesses fail and succeed all the time. So, you enter into it as a business person, and if you fail, you fail. This is the kind of Michael Gove argument: public goods and public support. You support the public goods provision, and you let the farm business succeed and fail in the marketplace. Clearly, that's not where we are. We've seen with the sort of levels of destitution that, for many people is just a survival strategy. The fact that you have a hectare of land allows you to eke out a living. Do we sustain that is a question that you're asking. Is it sensible to carry on that survival strategy? And that's problematic because, it's not a very good survival strategy for the people who are encountering it on a daily basis. Is it a way of life because there's no other alternative? Should there be public subsidy for a way of life that's no longer viable without alternatives? And I think that's at the core of the protests, which is there is no alternative way of life. And the risks that an individual farmer faces are in their minds being magnified by the proposals that go on the table in terms of the farm bills. So the lack of assurance about input prices, about a minimum support price, about exposing farmers to an unknown corporate transaction, as opposed to the familiarity of the exploitative moneylender who would give them a line of credit at really exorbitant rates, but still it was the known evil as opposed to the unknown. That's what lay at the heart of the protest, because what was being introduced without, I guess, adequate consultation was a system that was uncertain and risk-laden. And they were being asked to adopt that system. And I think the protest was a response to that. So I guess, in the time available, that's probably all I can say.
Anita, would you like to say anything to close?
I think, if it's on the question of farmers' protest, I think coming back to this issue that the last decade, maybe after the Farmers Commission report, particularly, which was based on wide consultation with farmers across the country, I think people felt that if these things are implemented, which included not just the three that I said, but also, extension, many other things. There were 5 volumes of the report, and there were many other things to do with youth, to do with skilling and education, to do wide ranging. I think what has triggered for me this farmers' protest is that, especially Prime Minister Modi, I think he made it an election issue that I'm going to implement the recommendations, and I'm very much concerned about the farming community, and I want to support the farming community, and therefore I'm going to implement the recommendations of the Farmers Commission report. And when that didn't happen, and I think that's where the frustration really has increased over the last 4 or 5 years, because people are aware of it. There's a lot of, again, knowledge about what it contains, and that now that you've been promised that you're going to do it, and then you're not doing it. And actually, what seemed to be in these farm laws is something against the interests of farmers, rather than, because they're not included in decision making. I think I've read the farm laws. I think the basic thing is they use some of the language of the Farmers Commission, but basically the safeguards which were there for farmers have been dropped. So any kind of legal recourse, if they are taken for a ride by the the private sector or contract farmers, I think the legal safeguard has basically been removed from this. And I think that has become the main concern, the pinch point really for farmers. And my concluding thing would be, I think if we can learn anything, I think, we have to plan with farmers.
Yeah. I wish we could have a whole conference on this, but we do have to end. Thank you so much. I think let's continue over drinks. There's tea outside, and we're going to have some remarks.
Yes, Chaz is going to have some concluding. Chaz.
You want to do that here?
No, outside.
Oh, outside, okay.
Not outside. Yeah.
Oh.